K. Satchidanandan is a bilingual poet, critic, playwright, editor, fiction writer, and travel writer. He's the recipient of no less than 52 literary awards, and he has 30 collections in Malayalam, 10 collections in English, with translations of his work in multiple languages, including Arabic, Irish, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Chinese, and Japanese, besides, of course, all the major Indian languages. So, over to you, Arunava, to take this conversation forward. Thank you.
So good to see you. I thought we would start today's conversation, Satchida, by asking you to interpret what our title today means to you. What is the silence or the various silences that you've encountered in the course of your life as a poet? And how have you been writing against it?
Yeah, in fact, I should say it's a kind of reverberating silence, a silence that seems to fill the nation, a silence forced upon the writers and all the perhaps the public intellectual community by a state that is getting increasingly repressive. So we know how some writers were murdered, some writers were silenced, and there is always a fear of censorship that is creeping in. It is becoming increasingly difficult to state the truth openly because there is a regime of untruth in the whole country. And the propaganda machine seems to be working 24 hours for the state, while all the media seem to have been sold out. It is impossible almost to speak the truth, but then we have to find a way of telling the truth, and that is the ultimate duty of a writer, to speak truth to power. And that's what at least a few people like us have been trying to do and are still trying to do. I would maybe, Arunava, if you don't mind, I'll begin with a poem, not exactly about silence, but in some sense against silence. It's a rather recent poem, The Nation of Birds. The nation of birds has no borders, nor a constitution. All those who fly are its citizens, including poets. Its flag is the wing. Have you ever heard a cuckoo quarrel with a nightingale over its song? Or a crane driving a crow away for its color? If the owl hoots, it is not because it is jealous of the parrot. Has an ostrich penguin ever complained they can't fly? They begin chatting with the sky as soon as they are born. Clouds and rainbows descend to stroke them. At times they lend their hues to the birds, like the cloud to the doves or the rainbow to the peacock. They dream seated between the sun and the moon. Then the sky fills with angels and stars. They can see even in the dark, chat with elves and fairies. They come down to earth to comfort the grass, open the flowers with their song. The fruits and worms they eat burst out of their eggs with tiny wings. One day I tried living as a bird. I lost my nationality. Nation is a cage. It feeds you first for your song, and when it begins to dislike your song, for your meat. Thank you, Arunava.
Course of this, and not just stop at one poem. But going back to that idea of silence that you mentioned, we're seeing it now in a particular form, but have you as a poet encountered this attempt to silence poets right throughout, or even earlier and continuously?
Well, we have passed through an emergency when most of us could not write, at least could not write directly about what was happening in the country. So many of us resorted to allegory or symbolic poems, poems that would convey their meanings secretly to the readers, but could not be understood easily by the authorities. I remember writing a poem called "The Tongue Tree," which was like a folk tale, but which was very very well understood by the people for whom it was meant, and not understood, as far as I know, by the police and by the authorities. So we have encountered periods like that. And today, once again, we are passing through another kind of emergency where there is no emergency declared, but when the minds are filled with fear and it becomes more dangerous to speak the truth. And personally, well, I have not been silenced as a poet, even though I have been attacked, and I get being attacked, especially by the right wing forces, especially on the social media. Many times I have been banned, my Facebook account has been stopped, and many times I have encountered angry crowds. But so far, well, I have been in a larger sense safe compared to many other writers who had to suffer much worse fate, like Gauri Lankesh who was murdered, or M.M. Kalburgi who was murdered, or others that we know, like Pansare, for example, who were all killed for their views, just for their views, and not for anything that they really did, just for telling what they felt they should be telling the world and telling the nation. So, so it is quite likely that something like that might happen to anyone who tells the truth. And I think this is the time when there is a demand for absolute fearlessness. Especially, people expect this fearlessness from the poet. I mean the real people, people who believe in democracy, people who believe in the constitution, people who believe in the idea of India. I think all of them are in danger, and so we need to be fearless to speak out and to speak against the repressive state.
Do you, as a poet, also see silence from the people? And again, I don't just mean in today's context or only in a political context, but considering everything around us that has been for a while and continues to be. Other people, do you find the people silent, or do you find them speaking up in relationship to poetry?
Well, there have been times, as we know. I mean, for the time being, I am confining myself to this particular period from 2014, even though this can apply perhaps to other times as well. You first saw writers returning their awards to the Central Sahitya Academy. Then you saw protest at the Film and Television Institute of India. Then you saw protest from philosophers and scientists and historians and various kinds of social scientists. And then you had protests at the IITs like IIT Madras, and you also saw the great protest against the revision of the Citizens Act. I mean, the Citizens Amendment Act, and you saw the great peasants protest in the country, which was unfortunately stopped by the plague. I mean, the COVID. So even during this period, people have been trying to speak up, even though I find that a good majority, particularly of middle class intellectuals, have fallen, unfortunately, silent. This is something I experience even on the social media. When I speak about a birthday, well, there are a lot of people who come and comment and say and wish me a happy birthday. But when I make a kind of ominous comment about something dark happening around me, I find there are very few voices that support me. There is almost a complete silence. So there is frightening silence all around, even though once in a while there is an eruption of eruption into voice of this suffocation of this silence.
Sachita, we have heard of times, and some of us have lived through times when the words of poets were on everybody's lips, when they were the rallying cry for people, both for their public and their personal acts. What is this? Where does poetry stand today, do you think, in the present day?
Well, I think the poets who really want to tell the truth have always stood with the truth and have always shown the courage to say that. See, because it says, like Pablo Neruda, "Come and see the blood in the streets," and also it says ultimately the poet's voice never dies, and like Cheswami Walsh would often say, in a room full of people who are engaged in a conspiracy, a word of truth sounds like a pistol shot. And so a word of truth, I think, even today sounds like a pistol shot in a country. It's not a room, actually, in a country that seems to be filled with conspirators, filled with people who want to suppress every freedom that people enjoy and every freedom that the constitution has really given them. So poets have stood up, and many poets do stand up. But I should agree with you that there are a lot of poets from whom we had expected greater courage and better and more meaningful articulation have fallen silent. That is a misfortune. Even very eminent poets whose voice we had all revered, I think, have fallen silent, or at least fallen short of what they should have been saying, or what we expect of them. So it's a kind of mixed feeling that I have about poets in India today. There are some who speak up, and there are many who are silent, and there is another kind of silence because they speak about romantic love, they speak about flowers and trees and all those beautiful things that the Urdu poetry, for example, may speak of, but they seldom speak of what they see around them. They seldom speak of what they see on the streets. They seldom speak about genocides. They seldom speak about hatred. They seldom speak about a country, a country that is essentially multi-voiced, polyphonic, a country whose culture is has never been single, but a country which had so many regional cultures and languages and religions suddenly turning into a kind of monolithic nation. So I think it is a duty of any writer in his own or her own interest to speak the truth now, because they may never get another chance to speak the truth.
I was just reminded, Sachita, of a line by the Bengali poet Subhash Mukhopadhyay. In Bangla, he said, "Phul khelibar din noy oddo." It's not the day to play with flowers.
Yeah.
Now, if we go back to your own life as a poet, and you have always been very centrally located in the polity and society that you occupy. You have never been at a distance from it. But how is your relationship with your poetry, or how is the relationship of your poetry with the world around you evolved and developed over the years?
Well, it's of course a very long story. Obviously, it's a story of half a century, into whose details I cannot go now. But then, yes, I began when what is called Adhunikata or modernism was coming up in Malayalam poetry. That was the time when some of the senior poets like Ayyappa Panikar, who was like a guru to me, had initiated a new kind of poetry. They were rewriting the rules of poetry, changing the canon, changing the structure, bringing in new kinds of images and new kinds of new ways of thinking and writing. And I was also identified as one of the modern poets. But something happened to not only to me but to some of my friends around the maybe mid 70s, that our poetry turned a bit political, not always directly, very often and not always loudly, but subtly it turned political. or I could say history entered our poetry, perhaps without our own knowing. And that had a background, as perhaps you know, that is the time when so many uprisings were happening in the country. Women were beginning to raise their voice for egalitarianism against patriarchy. The Dalit writing was coming up in several of the important languages in the country. And there were peasants' revolts in Naxalbari, in quite a few other places in the country. So that and there were two major strikes. The strike, especially the strike of the port workers, the workers at the harbor, and all these together somehow had a kind of impact about which we were not very much aware at that point of time on our poetry. And so our poetry, even though I would not say that it became public poetry from that moment onwards, it never became public poetry in the complete sense of the term. But yes, there was an element of public poetry in what we wrote, at least from the mid 70s. And then came the emergency, which compelled some of us to write against it. I wrote quite a few poems during that time. It was not easy to be published, but fortunately in Kerala things were a little better, and the censors were a little kinder, and so some of my titles were removed. But because even a Tagore poem was not allowed to be published, because I had started a series of translations at that time called the Voices of Freedom, which was being serialized in a Sunday newspaper. So they did not allow the title, and they did not allow even Tagore's, the well-known prayer for the country. But many other poems were allowed, and my own poems were sometimes censored in some journals, but the same poem got published in some other journal, because the first journal was evidently political, while the other one was not known to be very political. So that was how we got over. Of course, I was questioned by the crime branch 3 times, and there was a crime branch man always at my gate. At that time, I was teaching in a college in Kerala. But it was a little later that I got arrested and released on bail. Of course, the case went on for 6 months, and finally we were all exonerated by the court. So anyway, so passing through all this, which was in some sense a kind of lesson about the situation in the country, helped us grow a kind of resistance which became inherent in our poetry. It was not something that was exported or imported into our poetry. It became a part of our poetry, something inbuilt. And that, I think, continues even today. I said about speaking about flowers and speaking about love. So, no, I have written quite a few love poems. There's a whole collection of love poems of mine called Whispering Tree in English, and another one in Malayalam. I have quite a few poems also, poems on nature, on trees, on birds. I have written about many of these things about which poets generally write. Written about the sky, the beauty of nature, written about because I have always believed that poetry has many dimensions. Poetry is a conversation with oneself. It's a conversation with others, or what you call society. It is a conversation with nature, and it is also a conversation ultimately with the cosmos in which you live, the larger world, because where you begin to ask questions about the meaning of your existence and all those ultimate questions that philosophers and poets have been asking from time to time. So my poetry also has all these dimensions, but certainly political or social resistance is one of the major strands with which my poetry has been made or woven. And that has become perhaps a little stronger in the last few years, especially since 2014, or even before that, because I had written some ominously prophetic poems about what was going to come. I had written a poem called Mahabharata, where I was almost prophesying what was going to come in the 2014 elections, and that continues. I continue to write several similar poems, some of which I will read in the course of our conversation.
In fact, this is a good time, Satchidanandan. Why don't you read us a poem?
I'll do that. Let me read this poem, which anyway I suddenly found. Questions from the Dead, an essay on nationalism. It is a kind of continuation of the poem I read earlier. Which country's border was Huan Sang crossing when, on a donkey, he crossed the Himalayan pass with a sack full of Buddhist texts? Whence came the races that spoke Dravidian and Aryan tongues? Was there no one in India when they landed here? Not even a tribal? Where did the Bharatvarsha of Mahabharat and Meghadooth begin? Where did it end? Did Bhasa and Kapilar belong to the same country? Where were the borders of the India of Fahian or of Al-Biruni? Where was Takshila? Where was the India Alexander set out to conquer? Which country did Ashoka and Akbar rule? Who created India? The East India Company or Mountbatten? Or was it Gandhi? When did Hindu become the name of a religion? When did Earth come to be in the history of the universe? When did nations come to be in the history of Earth? How many nations make a human body? What is the kinship between human soul and nations' maps? Did all the births of Bodhisattva take place in India? How many oceans are there in each language? How many skies in winds? How many seasons for love? I had been guarding the borders till yesterday. All my life, I had arguments about borders. My living flesh bled, caught in their barbed wire fencing. I went to court in their name, killed many times, died many times. They said I would become a martyr if I died for the cause, that it would secure heaven for me. My land, I do not loathe you, nor do I worship you. Had I been born elsewhere, I would have lived another life. I would have needed a passport to enter you. Today, at last, I am going to cross all the borders and become part of the earth. Do not cover me with flags. Today, I know we are a creation of coincidences, like our body, like the solar system. We have no scope for pride, and war does not have even that scope. Bury me deep without an anthem. No one ceases to ask questions just because one is dead. No one ceases to ask questions just because one is dead.
Thank you. Satchida, you mentioned this idea of a public poet.
Yeah.
Would you tell us, unpack that idea a little bit, and also tell us where you think you will stand in relation to being a public poet in India?
Well, there are quite a few critics who consider me a public poet because a good part of my poetry, somehow can be labeled public. But I personally do not consider myself purely a public poet because, as I said, I have been writing about several other themes, and I think it is a rather wide thematic range that I have covered over the last 50 years or so. But I think there are certain times which almost compel you to address the public in a way that we hope they will understand. And perhaps, as I said, we are passing through that kind of a time when that part of you, which is a public poet, has to articulate itself. And that's why I said in the recent years, my poems perhaps have become a little more public than they used to be, even though I continue to write very, very private poems, poems about my mother, about my father, about my family, poems about my friends. I do keep writing all of them. But then there is this public voice, which is often taken more care of, or more keenly listened to by those who read my poetry and the critics and admirers of my poetry.
In In the 1990s, early in the 1990s, we saw the large-scale shift of the Indian society and economy to a liberalized structure. And since then, we've been drawn along more and more along the lines of neoliberal dreams, ambitions, and overall changes in framework. How do you think that has changed people's relationship with poetry? Have you found yourself as a poet who wrote before and after? Have you found the relationship of your readers with poetry changing? Because we live in such a utility driven space now. Everyone seems to be doing things only for some kind of improvement or betterment. So, where does a poet like you, where does poetry in general stand in this scheme of things?
Yeah, I know that it is becoming more and more a career driven world, where even the young think more about their career and read mostly only what they need to develop a career. Uh, and if somebody wants to become an IT professional, the only thing he or she reads is mostly about information technology and the new developments in information technology. Uh, and that I will not say that has not affected the readership of poetry. It has negatively affected the readership of poetry. But I find also it is perhaps very strange and ironic that the number of poets has also gone up. I think it has happened in Bengali, and I'm sure it is happening in many of the languages, especially in places where in the internet has a wide reach, and where you have several media where you can publish your poetry without being censored or without being edited either by you or by an editor. And so I find that the cyberspace reverberates with poetry. There are poets who have their own blogs. There are poets who write on the Facebook. There are poets who publish books on their own without depending on publishers or without depending on public journals. So this is a very curious kind of situation, because I find on the one hand the proportion between the number of poets and the quality of poetry has changed, because I think there are more bad poets today than we ever had. Sorry for using this word bad poet, but I mean it in my own sense, because all of us have our own norms for poetry. So there are a lot of poets who seem to be just writing offhand, looking around, and then you know uh, putting their daily experiences to pen. And I find a lot of poetry that appear in social media is not poetry in any sense of the word. Even though I have also come across very fine poets, even among them. In fact, I was the first to edit a collection of blog poetry in Malayalam. Quite some years ago, I was asked by our major publisher, DC Books, to edit a collection of blog poetry. And I called it the in Malayalam Nalamidam, which would mean the fourth space, because you remember Homi Bhabha had called the diasporic space the third space. In fact, I had edited a collection of diasporic Malayalam poetry, which was called the third space. And so I thought this was perhaps the fourth space. And there I had tried to bring together some of the better poets who were having their blogs or who were writing in on various kinds of cyber media. So there is so that's what I said. This is something that looks like a paradox, that on the one hand careerism has certainly gone up. Careeristic tendencies have gone up in the society, and on the other, the number of people writing poetry has also gone up, thanks to the internet and the various kinds of cyber platforms available to poets. So looking at my own works of poetry, I find that their circulation has been somewhat steady. I would not say it has grown very much, nor has it gone down very much. But I also know that it is not the same readers who read my poetry. There was, for example, the readers who read my early works. They were not the readers who read my later works. but the numbers remain almost constant. So every book goes into maybe 3 or 4 editions, and then some collected poems come appear. Not collected by me necessarily, but by somebody who reads my poetry. One film actor has selected some of my poems. Another young poet has selected some of my poems, and they have all published their own selections from my poetry. So I find that I have had a steady readership, even though I would not say it is the same readership. This is my personal experience. And But there are many poets, as I said, who do their own publishing. They publish their own poetry, and in fact, several publishers, at least in Malayalam, have come up who take a lot of money from poets and publish, because there are a lot of aspirants for poetry these days. Many people want to become poets, and so they are prepared to pay, and they have money too. And so the publisher will take maybe 50,000 rupees from a poet and print 100 copies and give the poet, and he makes a good profit without doing much work, even though it does not in any way help the growth of poetry in my language or in any language for that matter. So there has been a major change in the publishing scene, not only in the writing scene, but in the publishing scene. We have at least 50 or 60 publishers, who publish chiefly poetry, and in most cases, I find they take money from the poets and publish them. But there are also major publishers who are very selective and careful, and they publish comparatively what can be called reasonably good poetry. So that is the kind of seed that we obtain today. So careerism has affected reading somewhere. At the same time, there are poets who still have uh, at least a good number of readers.
Sachita, who are the poets you're reading now, but do you find yourself particularly reading at this point of time? Or in recent times, not just right now.
Yeah, I have been reading a lot of younger poets from Africa and from the Caribbean and from smaller countries. In fact, I also translated a collection of poems from Sweden. I brought out a collection of Swedish poems in Malayalam. I went to Stockholm. I was invited actually, and I sat with the poets, and I translated almost directly, of course, with the help of English as a in between language. And so I find that lot of good poetry is being written in smaller languages today, and I have been reading quite a lot of these poets, besides, of course, poets from some of the other Indian languages. I was reading some translations of Anshuman Kar, for example, in Bengali, and quite a few other younger poets who are coming up in Hindi. There is somebody called Anu Anamika who lives in Kerala, who has been writing beautiful poetry in Hindi recently, because Hindi is a language I have direct access to. And so I have been reading some of the new poets coming up in the languages, and also some poets from abroad. I mean, it must be a long list. I'm not going into all the names. I am not speaking of people, poets like Szymborska and all, whom I kept reading all the time, or the older poets like Lorca or Neruda, whom I keep rereading. But there are new voices which are in fact coming up, and I do enjoy reading poetry, and there are also very fine Arabic poetry coming up these days from various countries where Arabic is the main language. Not only Palestine. Palestine, of course, has some very good poets. After Muhammad Darwish, we have Najwan Darwish, we have Asma Azaize. So these are two of the very very fine poets who write in Arabic these days. Of course, Asma lives in Israel, but she's really a Palestinian poet. And Najwan and Asma, who are also my friends, are very fine poets who write in Arabic these days. I keep reading them in translation.
Sachita, how do you find poets around the world respond? Because there's probably a greater time of political and social turmoil than we have seen in recent times. Unless, of course, it's the internet that's making it bigger than it is, or bringing it more to us than we used to know about in the past. But do you see any distinct differences or new ways in which today's poets are responding to the realities around them?
Now, in fact, there has been a series of formal experiments in poetry. Many of them use the possibilities of the internet, including in Malayalam, if I can call them Malayalam poets, because some of them are just visual poets. We have a visual poet called Donna Mayura who writes poetry with her body. She decorates her body, or she writes sometimes words, or she uses feathers or flowers and adorn her body, and she creates that kind of visual poetry. We have another poet in Malayalam called MP Pradesh, who is a very fine and a very subtle poet who writes poetry with words as well as objects. He uses photographs of ordinary objects, sometimes of water, sometimes of pots, sometimes of leaves, and combines these photographs with beautiful and very subtle lines of poetry. And then there are poets who use the possibilities of the new medium. Like there are hyperlink poets, for example, because now it is possible that you can write a line or a word and give a reference. I mean, yeah, you and with a click you can go to the place referred to or the event referred to, and so they use these hyperlinks to create a kind of allusive poetry, which is easier to access than poetry was when, for example, T.S. Eliot was writing The Wasteland, whose centenary we are celebrating now. Because at that time you had to go to so many books to understand, to decode all those various references. But now it is much easier, and so they do hyperlink poetry. So there are meta poets, hyperlink poets, visual poets, performing poets. So the modes of poetry have changed. Not that the language has ceased to be the major medium of poetry. I think still the majority, not the majority, I would say 99% of poets still depend on words, on language, on skillful, suggestive, powerful, intense use of language to write poetry. So it is still a major linguistic artifact, or a genre that belongs to literature in the conventional sense. But these experiments are happening, and I welcome these experiments because some of them seem to be really doing good work. So these are the formal changes happening. And if you and one other thing I just wanted to mention now was, a lot of dialects are coming up. People who speak what we call the dialects. As you know, I don't know, it is a kind of political term. And there is this famous saying that a dialect can become a language when it has an army and a political party. But many of these languages, which were called dialects earlier, they have begun to write in those dialects, including several tribal poets. The latest happening in Malayalam poetry, for example, is the emergence of a series of excellent tribal poets who write in their own tribal languages. They have their own names, Kuruma language, and various names they have. So they write in their language, but when they publish, they write. They use because many of these languages do not have scripts, so they write their original poems in Malayalam script, and then they do a kind of Malayalam version of it, and they publish them together. And even major weeklies like Madhubhumi, which is the most important literary weekly in Malayalam, they have also begun to publish many of these poets: Sukumaran Chaligadda, Ashokan Marayur, Dhanya Vengachiri. There are quite a few, young poets, very very young. They are between 20 and 30, most of them. So they are writing beautifully, and that is a different kind of poetry. Not only because they are writing in tribal languages, but they are speaking about tribal experiences, about being surrounded by the forest, and their kind of relationship with nature, with animals and trees, and the kind of miserable life that they often lead, in spite of all the reforms that happen in the name of tribal reforms which are sometimes brought by government, sometimes propagated by the various NGOs. In spite of that, the tribal life in Kerala and in perhaps in most parts of India has not improved very much. And they speak about that too, the kind of hell that they have been passing through, and also their intimacy with nature. So there is a new theme, a new language, a new idiom, new images, and I would say that is the most exciting thing that is happening in Malayalam poetry today, and perhaps that is happening also, as I understand, in some other parts of India, including Gujarat, where there is a major Bhili population.
Satchidanandan, before we end, I'd like to ask you about translation because you translate your own poetry. And do you believe that poetry of all the written forms has the closest relationship with the language in which it is written? And therefore, translating it is perhaps even tougher than translating any other form?
It is certainly tougher than translating prose, whether it is an essay or a novel or a short story. But I would not say, and I cannot say really that it is impossible because translating poetry is impossible. We have grown up with that kind of saying. We have heard it very often repeated, and that I think is because of a kind of misunderstanding about translation itself, because a translator does not try to actually recreate the same poem in another language. In fact, the translator is writing a poem, a poem which is very close to the original poem in the kind of feelings, in the patterns of imagination. So I have always been fascinated by two major approaches to translation. One is the Gayatri Spivak saying translation is intimate reading. So a translator is actually doing a kind of intimate reading of what he or she is translating. And the second is what Walter Benjamin, of course, he has written that beautiful essay on translation. But one line has particularly fascinated me. It is like calling into a forest and receiving its echo. So when you translate a poem, when you translate anything, but particularly a poem, you are calling into the forest of language, and you get an echo, and it is the echo that you find in the translation. So if you take translation to be something like this, perhaps translation is possible. But if you want the same experience that the reader of the original gets, maybe it's an impossible task. But you can recreate that experience in another language. And translation has not only losses. We always say a lot is lost in translation, but something is also gained in translation because it gains the rhythms and the tones and the textures of another language, which is a gain, even though it may lose the original music of the language from which it has been translated and the original tone and texture. It is more a replacement, a substitution than a loss. That has been my experience because I have been translating from other languages into Malayalam, and from Malayalam, not only my own poetry, but also several young poets into English. And all my experience, because I have about 3,000 pages of poetry from different languages in Malayalam translation, and at least some maybe 300 or 4, no, not 300, but including my own poetry, it must be about 700 pages of poetry in English translation, mainly from Malayalam and sometimes from Hindi. And so, with this kind of experience, what I feel is that perhaps everything is not lost in translation. And would we have known Lorca unless Lorca had been translated, or unless you knew Spanish? Would we have known Pablo Neruda? Would we have known Bertolt Brecht? Would we have known Szymborska? Would we have known Herbert? Take any name of a major poet, no, a major non-English European poet, or a non-mother tongue Indian poet. So we have read all of them. We have enjoyed all of them. We cannot deny that. When we say translation is impossible, we are actually denying a truth which we have experienced. Maybe the Spanish might say, no, this is not Lorca. It always happens. I am sure that even though you are a wonderful translator, Bengalis will still be saying, no, 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 this is not Mahashoda Devi, or this is not that writer, or this writer, Manoj Vyapari, or whoever. So the thing is that the mother tongue speakers will never be happy with translations. And remember, these translations are not meant for mother tongue speakers. They are meant for other people who do not know the language. And for them, It is a new experience, a great experience, a beautiful experience, as heavy and as intense as the experience of reading the original.
Thank you, Sachita. Before we open for questions, will you read us one more poem, please?
Okay, I'll just read a short poem. I'll read this short poem, which I'm sure you know, and because it is somehow almost everybody seems to know it because it has been in several textbooks and all that. But it is ultimately about language and poetry, so I would like to end with that. It is called Stammer. Stammer is no handicap. A very short poem. Stammer is no handicap. It is a mode of speech. Stammer is the silence that falls between the word and its meaning, just as lameness is the silence that falls between the word and the deed. Did stammer precede language or succeed it? Is it only a dialect or a language itself? These questions make the linguists stammer. Each time we stammer, we are offering a sacrifice to the god of meaning. When a whole people stammer, stammer becomes their mother tongue, just as it is with us now. God too must have stammered when he created man. That's why every word of man carries different meanings. That's why everything he utters, from his prayers to his commands, stammers like poetry.
Sachita, what do you want to tell poets?
Okay. Uh, Certainly do not write just because somebody has asked you to write, or some magazine or editor has asked you to contribute a poem. Write only when you feel very strongly that you need to write this poem, otherwise you will be choked, you will feel suffocated. So there should be an inner compulsion. And secondly, I would like young poets to read a lot of poetry. That's what I find, because generally when poets send me their poems, beginners send me their poems, the first thing I ask them is, who are the poets you read or you have read in your own language and also in the other languages you know, either directly or in translation. And many of them have no answer, or they say they have read some of their friends alone. So reading poetry in all the languages you know, reading the best poetry around the world is important. And locating yourself is important. And to locate yourself, you should know what has been written before you. So, for example, when I began to write, that was somewhere in the late 60s. Well, Malayalam, I knew what the Malayalam poets before me had written, and I find my location in that sense. So every poet needs to find his or her location. And finally, I have found translating poetry a very good exercise for beginners as well as those who are not beginner or not supposed to be beginners, because I believe that all poets are beginners. Because when I write a new poem, I'm trying to write a new poem about which I know very little. I have just the vacant, sheet of paper before me, and I have a pen, or I have the laptop, or before me. So I do not know what I am going to write. So I am a beginner before writing each poem. That way, all of us are beginners. But then translation, even in the literal sense of beginners, has I think helps a lot, because it helps you understand the ways in which other poets imagine things, other poets see things, perceive things, other poets think. It is like learning painting. You watch a master painter, you watch how the fingers pass, you watch how the colors come alive, you watch how the spaces appear on the canvas. And so translation is that way a great learning activity. So these are some of the things, these are not pieces of advice, but some of the things that I have learned from my own experience, which I would share with the younger poets.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, I was just thinking of the title, and it is true that everyone everywhere will try to silence poets. Isn't that right, Sachida? It doesn't matter what the setup is. Poets speak too much truth. Thank you. On that note, we will end this session. Over to you, Abhik. Okay. Thank you very much, Sachida. Thank you for
Thank you.
joining us this
Thank you.
afternoon.
It was good to see you after some time.